Let's go ahead and get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Bricker, and I'm the chairman of the Arkansas District Export Council. And I want to welcome you all to Incoterms, the world's essential terms of trade, featuring the one and only Mr. Graham Catlett of the Catlett Law Firm. Thanks for being here, Mr. Catlett. I want to begin today by thanking our sponsors. This webinar would not be possible without the Arkansas Economic Development Commission and Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions. Their support allows us to host these webinars and meetings, and it wouldn't happen without them. So thank you both so much. I really appreciate you all joining us today. For those of you that aren't quite sure of who the deck is and what we do, allow me to do just a quick introduction. We're a private nonprofit organization that brings together experienced international business people with potential exporters. Each DEC member has been appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce for our real-world expertise in international trade. We have a ton of experience within our council in many different sectors. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we know all the answers, but what we can do is introduce you to someone who does. We are basically a community of connections within the exporting world. My hope for the day is that you walk away from this webinar with a little bit more confidence in your exporting abilities. If you have any questions at the end of this webinar and you don't feel comfortable asking it here, I invite you to reach out to us on our website, exportarkansas.org, and we'll have one of our members reach out to you. Basically, we want to be your strategic partner to help you grow your exports, which helps grow your bottom line. Now, before we begin, I want everyone to know we typically have these meetings open for everyone to participate and see each other and communicate. But we had so many people register that in order to accommodate everyone, we had to hold it as a webinar. So I hope that doesn't deter you from asking questions either in the chat or in the Q&A section there at the bottom of the screen. Now, I'd like to introduce everyone to your moderator this afternoon, Mr. Rudy Ortiz. Rudy has recently retired from the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, and he's also the previous chairman of the DEC. Today, he is the owner of Strategic Business Services, LLC, where he assists companies in a wide variety of international business and exporting needs. He is also a partner with Cross-Border Business Consultants. That's nice. Which is a global team of elite international business consultants working together to assist companies to initiate business activities in other countries. So for these reasons, he is the DEC's education chair. Rudy, thank you so much for spearheading all of this. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Jonathan, thank you so much, and thanks for the kind words. As Jonathan alluded to a minute ago, our speaker today is Mr. Graham Catlett, and Mr. Catlett has a long history of assisting private companies in developing commercial and legal and political strategies for their growth into domestic and international markets. He has been a goods and service exporter himself for over 30 years and has owned several business companies in the U.S. and Europe. And he's currently the managing partner of his own law firm. And Graham, thank you so much for taking time to provide us with this tremendous amount of information that you're going to provide to us and with all the experience that you have. So go ahead and take it away, sir.
Thanks, Rudy. It's a pleasure being with all of you today. Incoterms is a topic that we all know something about, but I hope that through this discussion today, we'll discuss and learn things that we did not know about. And before I get started, let me recommend two resources for you. The first is a app that can be acquired free from either the Apple Store or the Google Store, and it is called Incoterms, and it loads on your phone, and it will summarize the topics that we will cover today just by the use of images. And we'll use those images and diagrams in my presentation today, but for quick reference, it's a good thing for you to do. The other is the complete book by the International Chamber of Commerce on Incoterms, and it has the rules for each of the 11 Incoterms and all the detailed information that you need to know to understand the obligations and rights of both the seller and the buyer. And I recommend that anybody dealing with Incoterms to any extent acquire that book from the International Chamber of Commerce. Now, let me begin by going through, and let me make one other comment. I've listed my email address here, and I certainly welcome any questions after this seminar today. And feel free over the next few days, if you think of something, to write me, and I'd be happy to reply to the best of my knowledge. And I think it's a way for you to understand this topic better, particularly after it settles in for your thoughts. Let me talk about what we're going to do today, because these are the topics that I intend to cover. And the first is, what do the Incoterm rules actually do? And second is what the Incoterms do not do. I think those are very important, because a recent survey showed that only about 15% of the people using Incoterms were using them correctly, and 85% were using them incorrectly. And so I think as a foundation, it's important to know what they do and what they don't do. Third, we'll talk about the best way to incorporate the Incoterms, and then we'll cover the 11 Incoterms and summarize what they are, and the system or order within the rules. Briefly, then I'll talk about the differences between the Incoterms of 2010 and 2020, and then give you a brief description of the Incoterm, of a couple of the Incoterms, but we won't go through all 11 of them for the benefit of time. What do? Well, they do three primary things. They set out the obligations between a buyer and seller, and they secondly explain when the risk of loss shifts between the seller and the buyer. And third, they describe who pays which costs. And it's important to realize that these are the basic objectives of these Incoterm rules. Sometimes we think that they do more than what they really do. And here are the things that they do not do. They do not create a contract of sale, so that if you refer or use an Incoterm, that does not constitute a contract of sale. You can incorporate Incoterms into your contract of sale by using the terms, but standing alone, they do not constitute a contract of sale. They also do not provide for the specifications of the goods. They don't provide for the time, place, method, or currency of payment, remedies for breach, the consequences of delay, the effect of sanctions, imposition of tariffs, export or import prohibitions, force majeure, intellectual property rights, or the method, law, or venue for resolving disputes. So you can see that this is a checklist of the things that need to be in your contract of sale in addition to your use of Incoterms. The most common misuse of Incoterms is for people to think that they're just matters of pricing, and that there are ways for the buyer and seller to agree on a price. But as we'll see, there's a lot more detail and a lot more obligations set out and rights set out for each of the parties in these terms, but they're not simply for pricing. Now, how best to incorporate it into whatever you're needing, particularly your sales contract or a quotation. The way to do it is in three parts. First is you specify the chosen Incoterms rule. Second, you specify the named port, place, or point. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then third, you use the designation Incoterms, the registered mark 2020. For instance, CIF, Shanghai, Incoterms 2020, or DAP number 123 ABC Street, Conway, Arkansas, USA, Incoterms 2020. Now, you'll see a couple of things that you may not have thought about before. One has to do with the destination or the place of delivery. And you see here, I have listed port, place, or point. And I'll get into more detail about that. The third thing is the designation of what this is, this body of information is, and it's Incoterms 2020. There is also Incoterms 2010, and there are previous editions, but the previous editions have not been terminated or superseded. So it is important that when you use Incoterms, you refer to the proper year that you want to apply. And in our case, it's Incoterms 2020. Now let's talk about place. In all the rules, except the C rules, place indicates where the goods are delivered. In the D rules, the place is the delivery and the destination. So going back to the C rules, you see that the place is where the goods are delivered, but not necessarily the destination. And I've mentioned that in my third sentence here. In the C rules, the place is the destination, but not the delivery. So place becomes very important when you're designating your Incoterms place. Now, why is place important? Well, delivery is the place where the risk shifts from the seller to the buyer. And so that's one of the most important components and objectives of Incoterms, is to make it clear between the buyer and the seller where the risk shifts. And delivery is the magic word that designates that risk shift. Now, there are extremes. For instance, the delivery place that is closest to the seller is Ex Works. The delivery place that is closest to the buyer is DDP. So if you are the seller, you may want to use Ex Works because the delivery and the place where the risk shifts from the seller to the buyer is the closest to you. If you're the buyer, you may want to use DDP because that establishes delivery and shifting of the risk of loss, not until it reaches the buyer. Now, although I say these are the simplest for the most beneficial for the seller and the buyer. They may not be the most practical to use because the buyer may not accept X works from the seller, or the seller may not agree to impose on itself all the requirements of DDP. But the critical thing to learn from this slide is delivery is where the risk of loss shifts from the seller to the buyer.
So Graham, I guess what you're saying is that those are the two extremes, and obviously there's a lot of other options in between. Is that correct?
Yes, and we'll cover those in a minute. But those are the extremes. Now, when we say delivery place, what does that mean? Well, if we said delivery to the port of New York or the port of Long Island, there's a lot of different places in that port where delivery could occur. And so I suggest you identify a point, if at all possible, and don't just rely on a place or a port, but try to identify a specific point. Now, the rules will give you an answer if there is more than one point available and there is no designation. But for the benefit of the parties, it's better if they would identify a specific point. That even gets more confusing when multiple carriers are involved. And where does the delivery occur? And this is another reason for you to be very specific about what is the agreement between the buyer and the seller. Because often the answer is that the delivery is going to occur when the seller delivers it to the first carrier. And that may be a surprise to the buyer to learn that the risk of loss has shifted to the buyer much sooner than what the buyer expected. Now, to give you a list of these, they're divided into two different designations. The first are those rules which are applicable to any mode or modes of transportation. And those rules are the X works, free carrier, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, and DDP. And again, those can be used for any mode or modes of transport. The remaining four rules are only to be used for sea and inland waterway transport: FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. And we'll go through the details of each of those in a minute. Now, what we often don't know about these Incoterms is that in addition to just the name, which we think explains everything about them, it does not. Because with each of the rules, there are 10 sets of articles that explain in more detail what the obligations of the seller and the buyer are with respect to that particular rule. And the way it's organized is that for each of those 11 Incoterms, there is this organization of articles. The A articles are the seller's obligations, the B are the buyer's obligations, but there is a topic for general, for delivery, for transfer of risks, carriage, insurance, delivery and transport documents, export and import clearance, checking, packing, and marking, allocation of costs, and notices. So although we may think that we know what DDP or CIF means, these articles explain in a lot more detail exactly what they mean. And to show it in a little bit different format, the seller's obligations are in the A rules or A articles, and the buyer's obligations are in the B articles. And that's why it is so important for people using these rules to purchase this book from the International Chamber of Commerce, because it will have the details of each of these articles for each of the rules. Now, a couple of technical matters. It is legally not necessary to use the registered sign in incorporating the term into your sales contract. If you don't have that R with a circle around it, it doesn't negate your use of the Incoterms. But as I said previously, it is necessary to use the year of the Incoterms, because there are different versions of Incoterms that are issued about every 10 years. And the one that we are operating under now is the 2020 edition. All right, let's get into the details of those. And I want to start with the Incoterms for Ex Works. And I have on the screen this graphic, which is also a graphic that will be in the app that you can download onto your phone. But this tells a lot of the basic rules of this particular Incoterm. And let me show you how it works. Blue represents the seller and yellow represents the buyer. So for the term Ex Works, you see that the good, the package is outside the seller, but not yet loaded onto the truck, which is yellow, meaning the buyer. So the seller's costs, in blue here, extend only to this particular point or place. The goods are outside at the seller's, but unloaded. Risk of loss also shifts at this particular point, which is at the seller's location, but unloaded. The export formalities and the import formalities are both the requirement of the buyer. And you see the buyer is responsible for costs from where the goods are at delivery until they reach the buyer's place of business. And the risk is assumed by the buyer from the point of delivery to the buyer's place of business. So we'll see this system of graphics for each of the 11 as we talk through it. But let me show you the effect of the articles on this simple Ex Works Incoterm. The first rule has to do with the general obligations. And obviously it is that the seller must provide the goods and the commercial invoice in conformity that may be required by the contract. Any document may be in paper or electronic form, or where there's no agreement as is customary. The duty of the buyer is to pay the price. Any document may be paper or electronic, or if there's no agreement as is customary. The second has to do with delivery. The seller must deliver the goods by placing them at the disposal of the buyer at the agreed point, if any, at the named place of delivery. Now you see we're dealing with two different things here. The place of delivery is the broader term, but the delivery occurs at the agreed point if there is one. If there are several points available, the seller may select the point that best suits its purpose. The seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or within the agreed period. So this sets up several things that can be agreed between the buyer and the seller: the point of delivery and the date or a period within which the goods must be made available. The next is carriage. The seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of carriage. However, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk, and cost, with information in possession of the seller, including transport-related security requirements that the buyer needs for arranging carriage. So, even though this Incoterm is ex works, the seller still has some obligations. The seller still has to provide, if the buyer requests and pays for it, information regarding the goods, relating to the goods or security requirements that the buyer needs for arranging carriage. Transfer of risks. The seller bears all risk of loss until they've been delivered in accordance with A2, with the exception of loss or damage in the circumstances described in B3. And here we're saying the buyer bears all risk of loss for damage to the goods from the time they've been delivered. But if the buyer fails to give notice in accordance with B10, which is the time that it's going to pick up the goods, then the buyer bears all risk of loss from the agreed date or the end of the agreed period. Let me dwell on that a little bit. So if there is a specific agreed date and the buyer does not pick it up, then the buyer bears risk of loss from that day forward. If there is an agreed period for delivery and the buyer does not pick it up, then the buyer bears risk of loss beginning at the end of the agreed period. Insurance. Seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. However, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost with information the buyer needs for obtaining insurance. Delivery. The seller has no obligation. Export clearance. Here are the export clearance requirements that the buyer may request of the seller, and the seller has an obligation to provide this information if the buyer pays for it. So once again, even though this is the simple ex works provision, the seller still has some obligations to the buyer so long as the buyer requests it and pays for it. Checking, packing, and marking material, those are the costs of the seller. The seller must, at its own cost, package the goods. And as far as the buyer has no obligation to the seller. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered. And these under B9 are those that the buyer must pay. Notices. The seller must give the buyer any notice needed to enable the buyer to take delivery of the goods, and the buyer is entitled to determine within an agreed period the time of delivery. Now, I went through all those details, hopefully not to totally bore you, but for you to understand that these 10 subjects are incorporated into your contract of sale when you use an Incoterm. And these 10 for buyer and seller, of course, is going to or will be different based on the Incoterm that you select. So let's take another one. The next one is FCA. And on this one, you see from our diagram, there's a difference. Here, the package is in the truck. And so the costs of the seller have extended from where the package was outside the truck until it is loaded on the truck. And then at that point, until it reaches the buyer's destination, the costs are paid by the buyer. And as far as risks, the same thing. The risks of loss of the remain imposed on the seller until the goods are placed or loaded with the carrier. And from that point, the risk of loss shifts to the buyer until delivery. There's an alternative for FCA, and you can use FCA in this alternative situation where the seller is going to deliver the goods to an intermediate point for the benefit of the buyer. And so in this alternative image, you see that the costs of the seller include transportation to this particular intermediate point, loaded on the truck. And then at that point, the buyer's risks begin and continue until the package is delivered to the buyer's place of business or destination. For risks, the same kind of thing happens. The risks continue until the seller has delivered it or until the carrier has reached the intermediate point, and this carrier could be a truck of the seller. But then at that point, the risks shift to the buyer. That's FCA. Now there's a difference. The next one is called CPT. And let's see if we can identify what the differences are. In CPT, you see that the package is loaded on a truck and the seller's costs, in blue here, extend all the way to the to the buyer's destination, but they're not unloaded. From the point of unloading until they reach the buyer, the costs are borne by the buyer. And as far as risks, the risks of the seller extend to the loading in the carrier, but then the risks shift from the seller to the buyer. So you see what's happened in these two situations, and these two allocation of costs and risks, is that in CPT, the seller continues to be obligated to pay the costs for a longer period of time, but the risks shift soon. Now, so you see that place may be confused because delivery and destination are different places. Delivery is the point at which the risk of loss shifts. So delivery occurs here, but the destination, because the seller is paying the costs, is here. Now, another aspect or another rule that makes it a little more complicated is the CIP. And let's look at what's happening here. The truck is loaded and the seller has costs all the way to the buyer's destination, but loaded, not unloaded. The buyer is responsible for unloading. The risks shift here at the point of loading, and the buyer is responsible for risks. But now we've got a third line that is insurance. And you see under CIP, insurance is a blue line, which means it's the obligation of the seller to pay for the insurance. But look at the line right above it. The obligation to pay for the insurance doesn't mean that the seller retains the risk of loss. So in this situation, if there is a loss, who files the claim? Well, the answer is the buyer, because the buyer is the one who has the risk of loss. Now, the buyer may not want that. The buyer may not only want insurance, but they may not want to have to go through the hassle of filing the claim with the insurance company, and particularly if the insurance doesn't cover all the risks.
And Graham, in this particular case, we're talking about the buyer of the product, not the buyer of the insurance.
Yes, it's the buyer. This is always the buyer of the product, between a seller and a buyer. The seller is paying for the insurance, but the buyer has the risk of loss, and so the buyer is in effect the beneficiary of the insurance policy. So you see how that can be a surprise and needs to be carefully handled. Now, I say insurance, and so the question comes up, what kind of insurance? And we know basically that there are two kinds of insurance. There's all risk coverage and there's specified peril coverage. Well, one of the differences that Incoterms 2020 made is to change CIP insurance to all risk. So for the benefit of the buyer, the insurance is all risk coverage. Now that means the seller has to pay for all risk coverage, which is more expensive than specified peril coverage, but it does provide better coverage for the buyer. Of course, these things can be negotiated, and if the buyer is willing to accept specified peril coverage rather than all risk coverage, then that can be a variation from CIP. Now let's go to DAP. And here, the situation's a little different. The seller is paying all costs of delivery up until the product reaches the buyer's destination, but remains loaded in the truck. And the risk of loss remains with the seller during that same period of time. So the risk of loss does not shift until the product reaches the buyer's destination unloaded. Okay, so let's compare these two, DAP and CIP, and see which you would prefer. Well, in DAP, the seller is responsible for the costs and the risks the entire way to the buyer's destination. In CIP, the seller is responsible for paying the cost of transport and the cost of insurance to the buyer's destination, but is it the same? And the answer is no, it's not, because the risk of loss shifted to the buyer way back here at the seller's loading. And as I mentioned before, the practical effect of that is that if there is a loss, then the buyer must make the claim. And if the insurance for some reason is does not cover the peril that occurs, then the buyer has that risk of loss. So although these would seemingly be the same, they are similar, but they are not the same. And you need to think about which is the most applicable to your situation. All right, and then we go to DPU, in which the risks of loss and costs, the delivery, occurs at the buyer's destination unloaded. And then DDP, having to do with the same kind of thing, but unloaded. And the difference is going to be in the import and export formalities and who's responsible. I've gone back to DPU. You see, the export formalities are the sellers, the import formalities are the buyers with DPU. But with DDP, both the export formalities and the import formalities are the sellers. Although the buyer may like that, it may be impractical for the seller to actually clear customs for the benefit of the buyer. Now let's talk about inland waterways and who pays for all of this. Well, the first Incoterm is FAS, and it is free alongside ship, which makes sense. You see the goods are on the quay by the side of the ship. The seller is responsible for paying all costs to getting the goods up to the quay, up to the side of the ship. And that is the point of delivery where the costs shift and also the risks shift. And from that point forward, it's the buyer's responsibility. FOB is the same, except it is loaded onto the ship. The seller has a responsibility and the risk of loading, and then delivery occurs and there's a shift to the buyer. CFR shows that the costs are paid by the seller all the way up to the buyer's point of unloading, but the risk shifts at the point of loading at the seller's port. So once again, this benefits the seller, even though the seller's paying costs. The seller does not have the risk of loss after the goods are loaded. And then to round it out, we have the same situation with insurance, where the seller may pay for costs of delivery and pay for the insurance under CIF, but the risk of loss shifts for the benefit of the seller at a much earlier point. Now, you can see that I've not gone through all those articles for each of these, but they add a lot more specificity and detail as to what the obligations and the rights of the seller and the buyer are under each of those 10. Very briefly, the change from 2010 to 2020, there was a change from DAT to DPU. There's a difference in the insurance coverage. The insurance under both CIF and CIP used to be that specified peril coverage was all that the seller had to furnish. Now it's been changed so that in CIF, the seller has to provide all risk coverage, but in CIP, it does not. There's more specific guidance, more technical rules, and a different layout and presentation. So again, by the book. Now, we're not finished because many of you will have heard or seen terms like FOB Fayetteville, Arkansas, and wondered how that relates to FOB New Orleans Incoterms 2020. And you may have seen what is FOB, FAS, CIF, CNF, and ex-ship. Those have not been superseded by Incoterms. They're different. All these terms are in the Uniform Commercial Code. And if you don't put Incoterms 2020, then you're likely to use some of these terms and be governed by the rules and the law in the Uniform Commercial Code. That's one reason it is important to consistently use the Incoterms 2020 so that you don't get confused about whether you're using the Uniform Commercial Code abbreviations and designations or the Incoterms. So now let me say, breathe easy, relax. You've got this. It's not that difficult. And my final point is I'll take easy questions and for sure by the book.
Well, thank you so much, Graham. Obviously, he's being facetious, right? These things are complicated and can get you in a lot of trouble if you really don't pay attention. You may remember, I guess must have been almost a year ago now, where there was a ship that got sideways at the Suez Canal and blocked hundreds and hundreds of ships for about 6 days. And that was a real debacle from several different perspectives. And while you may think that that obviously it's the problem of the ship line, it isn't. These questions about where the risk stops and who's going to pay what are all covered by Incoterms. And what you think might make sense, it really doesn't unless you have it in writing, just exactly what the details are. So once again, it's just very, very important that you acquire the book and read through it and ask additional questions. Now, I do have a few questions that I'd like to cover with you, Graham, if at all possible. Let me see here.
I'll take easy questions.
Okay. So as it turns out, one of the gentlemen was asking about the difference between FAS and FOB, and I think I answered the question, but so what I've said was that FOB means free on board and differs from FAS in that the seller will pay the cost of export clearing and unloading, and he asked, unloading where?
All right, well, let's go back to the graphic. FOB means that the seller has to pay the costs until it is loaded on the ship at the seller's port. You see how the diagram works? And from that point, that is also the point of delivery. So risk of loss under FOB shifts at that point. Now, you mentioned CFR, and so it's different. Here, the seller pays the costs of delivery to the port of the buyer. The goods remain loaded, but the risk of loss shifts back at the seller's port once the goods are loaded.
Mr.
Okay.
Green, they were actually asking about FAS.
Well, let's see.
Yes, sir. Thank
Okay,
you.
FAS, go the other way. So FAS, the seller's costs and risks are transferred when the goods are alongside the ship on the quay before they are loaded.
Graham, can you show those two slides again? The one that you've got right now and the one for FOB so they can see the difference?
FAS and FOB. So the difference is being loaded. See, look, in this FAS, the goods are not loaded. And for FOB, the goods are loaded. Now there's some other rules, but that's basically the difference, is the cost and the risk of loading.
Okay, the next question comes from Ms. Kimberly Atkinson, and whether it's a easy one or not, I'm less sure. It says, with CPT, which carrier represents the shift in risk, truck or air, if an air shipment, for example?
Well, you're right. That is not particularly interesting because the basic rule on CPT, if there isn't any other decision, is it's when the seller delivers it to the first carrier. But when you have multiple carriers, you know, there could be a truck taking it to the airport. The air carrier could then deliver it to a truck to deliver, and that gets very confusing. And so I would suggest that you very specifically decide what you want. But I believe the rules are going to be that when the seller delivers it to the first carrier is when the risk of loss shifts.
Excellent. Actually, this next one, I actually have not seen before. It says, who is responsible for the DTHC designation terminal handling charges under CFR terms?
All right, let's go back to CFR and maybe we can figure it out together. Okay, so under CFR, the question is who's responsible for the destination terminal charges, right?
Right.
Okay, well, you see here that the costs of the seller include getting the goods to the quay at the buyer's port, but not unloaded. So any unloading and subsequent charges under CFR, once the goods reach this port, are the buyers. Okay.
And I think that this actually answers, and that graphic answers the young lady's next question: risk of loss or all additional charges. And I think that,
yeah, the graphic shows that the risk of loss switches back at the seller's port once the goods are loaded. You see?
okay. And we had another gentleman. It says, since CIF is only for ocean, what terms is appropriate for air delivery to a foreign airport?
Well, you can, there are a couple of answers to that. You can use your own designations, but if you're going to use CIF, then, or if you're going to use Incoterms, then you should use a similar designation. Let's see.
Like CIP, maybe?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to find here. Maybe CIP.
Okay.
And it has to do not with the graphics, because the graphic looked very much the same, but it has to do with the details in the rules making up each of these Incoterms, that they apply more to any mode versus ocean or waterway freight.
Okay. Next question. What is beneficial for the U.S. exporter? Ex-Works and in comparison, CFR, the pros and cons.
Okay, for the exporter, it's going to be, let's just look at it. Ex-Works, the costs and the risks shift before the goods are even loaded in the truck. So that's a big benefit. Now, if we come down to CFR, see if I can get to it here.
There you are.
CFR, you see the seller has to pay the costs not only from his place of business, but to his port, load it onto the boat, and pay the freight costs on the boat until it gets to the buyer's port. So there's substantial more costs that the seller will have to pay, and the risk is greater because the product has had to leave the, let's say it's a seller's manufacturing facility. The seller has to take it to the port and load it on the ship. So the answer to that is Ex-Works would be a great benefit, although there are some challenges using Ex-Works for exporters, having to do with preparing export documents and that kind of thing. So I don't want to get into the details, but it's not easy it's not sufficient for the exporter to just drop the goods outside his factory door and walk away from the transaction. He still has to provide some assistance to the buyer.
Yeah, and as we were discussing at the very onset, is Ex-Works and DDP are the extremes, right?
Yes.
On one hand, you could say that there's less worms, less difficulties, less challenges with Ex-Works for the exporter, for the seller, and DDP is more conducive in terms of the risk and cost to the buyer. But the reality is that especially when we're talking about sending something from the United States to Germany, so some place across the pond, it's going to be rare that the buyer is going to be satisfied with Ex-Works because he recognizes the level of risk, not so much the expense, because I mean it costs what it costs, right? But the risk more than anything else, where the risk stops, and with DDP, that's challenging. I have another question here by Tim Haggerty. He says, is FAS an antiquated pre-containerization term when goods were dropped loose at the pier? Today, we would expect any goods moving by ocean to be already containerized before being delivered alongside the vessel.
Well, this could apply to containers also, because you see from the graphic that the container, the seller's obligation is to deliver the container to the quay.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be containerized, but it has to be delivered to the quay. So it's still applicable.
Right. Okay. Let me see here. I don't think. Okay. Another person, Kimberly, said, hang on. When we were talking about CIF and CIP, she stated in that scenario, the exporter could charge those costs back to the buyer. Is that not correct?
Well, in the case of
CIP, I believe.
CIP, let's just get that up.
At the end of the day, despite who is going to wind up paying for it, I mean, just because the buyer wants you to give him a fixed price all the way to his door, it's not like he's going to get the shipping for free. I mean, the seller is going to charge him for every
Sure.
bit of any expense, whether it's insurance, whether it's the shipping, the risk, on and on and on. So, I mean, there's no free lunch. Really, I think, at least in my head, the biggest issue is not the cost, is where the liability transfers.
Yeah, I think that's right, Rudy, because in these cases, DAP versus CIP, the cost of the buyer may be exactly the same, and the cost of the seller may be exactly the same.
Right.
But if there is a loss, then it's going to be a hassle for one party or the other.
Oh yeah.
Who's
Yeah.
going to have to fight with the insurance company?
Yeah.
And
And now you're going to get paid
yeah,
for your loss. And Graham, you may correct me on this, but my understanding is, if let's say a ship is crossing the ocean and things get really, really, really rough, and the shipping people decide that they have to throw your container overboard. Can you tell us what's going on there?
well, there's a principle of maritime law that requires a cost sharing of all the goods on the ship, even though just a few containers go overboard. And so it's another reason to make sure you've got complete, full coverage, all risk insurance.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, the bottom line is this: you really need to pay attention. And just because the buyer says that he wants X doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give him X. It's a matter of negotiation and trying to figure out, how much risk are you willing to bear? And and once again, in terms of the cost, I don't think it would make hardly any difference at all. I mean, except that you would, wind up fronting the money, but you're going to charge the buyer for whatever expenses there are. Once again, the risk, the potential for something going wrong, which is extremely hard to calculate, right? So like in the Ever Given example, and other things that we see every single day, where containers are in fact thrown overboard, either purposefully or because of the storm actually, did something to them. So it's a matter of the risk transfer and your risk tolerance if something goes south. And I think with that, I think we have answered. Let me see. There's another one that came in.
Few more in the chat.
Yeah, I got. There should be usually a small margin to cover for a margin of errors when coding DAP. Or DDP or CF, yeah, absolutely. Once again, you got to cover your costs. You got to make sure that everything's covered. No matter how you quote this. All righty, I think that's it.
And I think, Rudy, just to reemphasize what you've already said, is the key to this is proper planning. And before you get into an export program or an export transaction, sit down with someone who's more knowledgeable than you, if possible, and think about these issues and which suits your objectives better. I know plan is a 4-letter word, and most of us hate it, but it can have benefit to us if we spend a little bit of time on it.
Right. And I saw an earlier comment about, well, if FedEx says this and UPS says that, I can't speak knowledgeably about that. But just because somebody works for FedEx or UPS does not necessarily mean that they have the full understanding either. It is, in fact, a complex issue, and it is incumbent upon you to know what the rules are and understanding what the real risks are. At the end of the day, the person who's going to suffer the loss, that's whose responsibility it is to make sure it's correct and that you understand it.
Real quick before we have too many people hop off here. One thing I wanted to acknowledge is that on this webinar, we have had people from all over the country, not just here in Arkansas. And no matter where you are, if you need some local help from your district export council, I would love for you to reach out to myself or Miss Heidi and let us organize an introduction for you to have local representation from your deck in your state.
Yeah.
And we would be happy to facilitate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jonathan. Just to reiterate what Jonathan said, there is a district export council in every state. Okay, we happen to be the one in Arkansas, and we're happy to introduce you to your deck. We have all the relationships already, and we can make those arrangements. But do work with your deck whenever possible. All righty. I think with that, we will close it out. I do want to introduce you to the contact information for Graham and myself and Jonathan and Ms. Heidi. If you need to contact any one of us for whatever reason, please feel free to do so. And I know that Graham would be more than happy, and he has stated so, to answer any additional questions that you might have. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will also want to make sure that you fill out the survey that Ms. Heidi is going to send to you. The only way that we know whether we're doing a good job and whether we need to make improvements is for you guys to tell us, what improvements you think need to be made. Also be aware that we're going to have a doing business in Mexico on June 14th, if I remember correctly. Is that correct, Ms. Heidi? June 14th?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. So do look forward to attending that particular webinar if that is something that is of interest to you. And as always, you can go to the Arkansas District Export Council website to look at a list of the upcoming webinars that we're having, and we have a tremendous amount of resources and information on our website as well.
Yes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, with that, thank you so much.
Links are in the chat, and I will be sending you the PowerPoints. When Graham sends them to me, I'll send them out to you.
Perfect.
All
Thank
right.
you again. God bless, and we will see you